Welcome everyone again. And again, thank you so much for being with us on this very, very hot Istanbul day. I'm sure that everywhere around the Northern Hemisphere, we are going through really scorching days. And thank you so much to Lynn Walsh, who joins us from upstate New York on a Monday morning. As I said, that this is the second masterclass in the Turkish Digital News Accelerator series. Lynn very kindly agreed to our invitation to talk about the new approaches to engagement and how to ensure trust in journalism. I know I was very familiar with Trusting News before, with their impeccable weekly newsletters, providing tips to journalists around the globe that how to foster trust in journalism, in news especially, and how to redefine relationships and ties with the readership and the audiences. So when LEAP, the project, the Innovation Lab, was announced by International Center for Journalists and Trusting News, I was very eager to jump in, to be a part of this participative and innovative process to launch products to ensure trust in journalism. So hence, I became much more familiar with Lynn's work. To introduce her very briefly, I will say that she's a very prominent journalist. She's an Emmy award-winning journalist who has worked in investigative journalism at the national level and locally in California, Ohio, Texas, and Florida. Currently, she's the assistant director at Trusting News. She's the former ethics chair for the Society of Professional Journalists and the past national president for the organization. Based in San Diego, Lynn is also an adjunct professor and freelance journalist. So today, Lynn will be talking to us in her head as the associate director of Trusting News, and will share with us the very tested solutions and innovative tools around the US from small and scalable newsrooms, since in Turkey, it is no mystery that the distrust in journalism and the trust issues with news in Turkey will be highly affecting for the years to come. So hopefully Lynn will be helping us to seek out solutions that will last and would be also financially beneficial, would contribute to financial sustainability of our independent newsrooms. For those who would like to hear Turkish translation, at the right bottom, you will see interpretation button. If you would like to switch, you can switch to Turkish, and please feel free to write and type your questions into the chat box. So I will be your messenger during Lynn's presentation, and hopefully at the end we will have a Q&A. The floor is yours. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here with all of you. I will be sharing my screen and going through some slides. And before I do that, I will just put a link here in the chat to the slides in case it is easier for you to follow along that way as well. So there is the link. And with that said, I will share my screen here. And you should be seeing it. Yes. So, as Gülsin said, my name is Lynn Walsh. I am the Assistant Director of Trusting News, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do at Trusting News and why looking at where trust stands in your community and working to rebuild it is so important. And so really quick to kind of set the stage, just some points of data and some research about where trust stands around the world and our Trusting News approach. So what we have found is, fortunately, overall trust in news worldwide has rebounded over the last year in almost all countries. So that's a good sign. Trust in sources people use most often is also up across the world overall when you look at the data. So that is good. Finland remains the country with the highest level of trust. The United States has the lowest level of trust. And so that kind of is just a very broad look and a couple data points. Some other research and points that I want to share with you come from our work at Trusting News. And so what we do at Trusting News is we work specifically with journalists to rebuild trust with their communities. Primarily, we do focus on local or regional journalism. We do work sometimes with some national publications in the US, and we also do work with some international news organizations. Primarily, Radio Free Europe has been an organization that I have been working with. But it's important to kind of understand some of these basic principles before you start working to rebuild trust. And so one of the first things we talk to everyone about is we can't persuade everyone to trust us. When I first started working for Trusting News, I thought, okay, the goal, let's get everyone to trust in news again. Unfortunately, that's not probably going to be possible. And if you work on focusing on that and trying to get some of the people who distrust it the most to trust in news, it can be something that's frustrating and something that sets you behind with those goals. So what we say is focus on the people who are willing to have conversations and leave others who may not be for sort of later. Another key point is that we know that being a news consumer is confusing and overwhelming. And there is a lot of information out there for people to consume. And so sometimes because there is so much information, that leads to them feeling overwhelming. It might lead to them absolutely turning off the news, not consuming news, and it can also lead to distrust. The other thing to keep in mind is that there are things that we as journalists can do to rebuild trust. And I'm going to talk about a couple of those things related to engagement today. There also, though, are things that are broken from the audience or in our community's standpoint. Some of that relates to media literacy and or just where they are going to get news. And so this isn't just all on journalists, but there are things journalists can do. Something else when you're talking to community members, they may say, oh, the media, all journalism is bad. Oh, that's fake news. Well, if you are producing accurate, responsible, ethical journalism, our job, your job as a journalist is to talk about that, is to explain what makes your work trustworthy. When we talk about trust and someone's likelihood to trust you, it involves both cognitive trust and affective trust. And so what that means is cognitive trust is based on like data. It's based on you consistently getting information correct, right? You report accurately, you report fairly, they can trust on you, they can count on that. Then there's the affective trust. The affective trust is that sometimes they may just see you on TV or hear your voice on the radio, and they might just relate to you because they sort of have this feeling of you being trustworthy. Maybe they see that they are similar to you. You have children, they have children. You're from the same area they are. And so that is important to keep in mind because when we talk about how to build trust, yes, you can do it with solid reporting, with accurate reporting. But for some people, that's not enough. For some people, they need that engagement part, which that's what we're going to talk about today. For some people, they want to hear from you. They want to be able to contact you. They want to be able to ask you questions. And when they can do that and build that relationship, that is something that can lead to trust. And so at Trusting News, one of the major ways that we know journalists can build trust is through engagement, which we are going to cover today, but also it's through being transparent. And that's where this last point is. A lot of times people make assumptions about our work. When they make an assumption, that assumption is generally negative. And so that is something that leads to distrust. So if we can be transparent and add transparency and explain the reporting process, that is one way to build trust. And we have a lot more research at Trusting News related to everything I just covered. There's data, there's more tips on transparency, also stuff related to engagement. But that is the link there if you want to learn more about that. And also I put my email in the chat and I'll put it in there again if you have specific questions that you'd want to follow up on. So as I said, transparency is one main way that you can build trust, but today we're going to focus on how you can build trust through engaging with your community. And the whole idea here, when we first start with engagement, you really do have to invest in understanding the landscape that you're working in. So the idea is understand who is in your community, where do these people live, what experiences do they have, what do they think about where they live, and most importantly, what do they think about your reporting? If you are able to ask that question and get that answer and have an understanding of that, that can help you build trust. And so we sometimes think that when we ask ourselves, what are the goals of our reporting? Some of you may say to inform the community, to have them trust us, right? We do our reporting with good intentions. I think all of you, if you are here, you would consider yourself responsible, ethical, accurate journalist. So those are good intentions, right? Well, what we know is those good intentions do not lead to automatic trust. We need to do more than that. We need to explain those good intentions, and we need to share those intentions with our communities. And that's where that engagement part comes in. Not only do we have to share those intentions, but we have to ask them for feedback about those intentions. And so the question then is, how do you do this? How do you best engage with your community with the goal of building trust? When we work with newsrooms who say they want to have a better understanding and build a better relationship with their audiences in their community, the first thing we ask them are, what are the obstacles in your relationship with your community? Sounds like a basic question, but it's something that journalists don't often think about. So we may get frustrated by sharing a story on WhatsApp, by sharing something on Facebook, seeing negative comments, not seeing any comments at all. That can be frustrating. But we may not take that next step to think about, why is that happening? Well, you may not be getting comments, or you may just be getting negative comments. Most of that is based on the type of relationship you have with your community. And so to figure out why that is happening, you need to ask, what is getting in the way of someone commenting or interacting with you? What is getting in the way of them feeling comfortable enough to communicate with you? What is getting in the way of them understanding why you are doing what you are doing? And so with this question, we have journalists think about, what are those obstacles in your relationship with your community? Maybe some of you could answer that right now. You might be able to make a list of those right now. Well, that is great. And you should do that, because that is kind of step one to rebuilding this trust and building trust. But if you don't know the answer to this question, that's okay, because there are ways that you can find out. And so I'm going to go through some ways that newsrooms have worked to answer this question, to learn about what those obstacles are. And they do it through engagement. And so when we look at this in engagement, we look at sort of, where does data live, right? Where is there data or information related to this? That first data set that we like to call that is, what does your staff hear? So what are your reporters hearing? What do they receive maybe an email about? What are people messaging them about on different social platforms? What are they seeing in comments? What are they hearing from sources or people they interview? What are they hearing from people who might come up to them in the street when they say they are a journalist, from family members? That's a really important data set. So one thing you could do if you're unsure about what obstacles or what's getting in the way of building trust, and or if you just want to build a better relationship or start down this path of building a better relationship, ask your staff, what are you hearing about your reporting? You could do that through a survey. You could do it through creating maybe a Google Doc somewhere, or maybe a channel on Slack where you can gather, just have people put in thoughts. And then once you have that, you can see if there are any trends. With all of these data sets, the key is you want to look for trends, and then you can act on what you're hearing. And I will talk about that after going through some of these other data sets. But the first way you can try to find out is you can ask your staff, what are you hearing? The next data set, and a place you can look to see what your audience thinks about you and for a way to learn how to better engage with them, is what are you seeing in online comments? What are you hearing on social media, on your website, in community groups? And again, you're going to gather all of that again, and you're going to look for trends. The next data set is to consider, what feedback forms do you use? This one's really important. And some of you, most newsrooms do have something like this, where they have email addresses on their website. Maybe it's a generic email address that says how to contact the staff. Maybe it's individual email addresses for reporters. Maybe when you tell people to contact you, there's a form that pops up. So the question is, if you are asking for feedback, that's good. That's a good step in the right direction. But the second question is, how often are you checking those forms? Are you replying to those people? Because if you're asking people for feedback, but you never reach back out to them, even if it's just thanking them for the feedback, that actually could contribute to distrust. And so you want to look at how you're asking for feedback, and then see if you're being clear about if they should expect a response. Should they expect someone to contact them? How often should they expect someone to contact them? So you want to be clear about that, because that can help set the expectation and not lead to distrust. But the other thing is you should be looking at that feedback form in the data that is there. And the idea, again, is you're going to look for trends. Something to also keep in mind is to not just look at the news emails. So sometimes you might have a marketing department, maybe someone dealing with your memberships or your people who sign up to be a subscriber, right? You want to look at that and include that in your feedback as well. Another data set is anywhere you ask for feedback in questions. Maybe this is on social media. Maybe this is on just a social post. Maybe it's in person. Maybe you are asking for people. Maybe it's in print. But you want another area where you could gather feedback and look for trends is looking at where you ask for feedback and questions. Something else you could do, and we've had some newsrooms do this, is do a survey from the newsroom with the specific goal of asking them, what do you think of our journalism? And if this is something that you want to try, I can send some kind of templates that we have to create this. Journalists who have tried this, keep it short, only like 5 to 7 questions. The idea there is you don't want to overwhelm people, and you're more likely to get more people to fill it out if it is a little bit shorter. You also want to keep questions very specific. So it's, you might ask something open-ended. What do you think of our reporting? Or do you find our reporting accurate? Do you find our reporting helpful? What suggestions do you have for us to improve our reporting? And it's important to both ask, if you do a survey, for both people's frustrations that they might have. So things you want to ask what maybe they're frustrated by, what they don't like, and also what they do like. Because I'm going to talk about how sometimes those frustrations, those complaints, those criticisms, even questions that they may have about your process can be tools that you can use to build trust. So those were the data sets. And the idea is you use those data sets to look for trends. Once you identify trends, then you're going to find a way to explain and basically turn some of those questions into answers. You're going to use some of that feedback to shape your reporting moving forward. You also are going to use that, that data set and those trends to turn misassumptions and close information gaps. And I have an example of that here from a newsroom in Florida, here in the US. So they used an investigative story that they did. Their investigative story was about how people who use midwives or who have at-home births, so people who do not go into the hospital to have their baby, but people who choose to do it at home. They investigated how that industry is regulated, how that industry, how women are either surviving or they experiencing complications. They looked at all of that within the industry and they came out with a story about that. Now, when they came out with an investigation on this, they had a long investigative story that was several thousand words. They also had an explainer that was separate that explained why they chose to report on this story, how they chose to report on the story, where the data came from, who they interviewed. And then they published all of that at one time. And so what I'm going to show you are just a couple examples of comments they received on Facebook related to the reporting. And as you can tell, the ones that I'm going to show you are sort of the criticism, the negative comments. And so what one person says is that, you know, their reporting is biased. Someone else says that this reporting was done to assist with legislation that medical profession wants. So the idea is here that the commenter says that the reporters and the story was meant to help pass laws and work with legislatures. Another complaint or comment, someone said this is a scare tactic article. They said you didn't do your research. Another thing that they said that they saw that the reporters saw money and revenue. And so the only reason they did this story is that they wanted to make money off of advertisers because the hospital there in the area is one of their advertisers. So that's why they did this story, to scare people away from home births and to encourage more people to have their births at a hospital. And again, these are all comments and from people who read the story or who at least commented on when the story was shared on Facebook. Someone else claims that it was inaccurate. They called it a smear campaign. And they also said that, you know, they're trying to create fear around the industry. Someone else accused the paper of being a propaganda machine. They're trying to misrepresent the facts. And then someone else just saying that they are biased against midwives and home births. So I'm pulling out the negative comments. They also got a lot of positive comments, but the reason I'm pulling out those negative comments is that sometimes when we see comments like this, sometimes journalists don't respond. Well, it's important to respond to comments, even if they are negative. And there's a lot you can learn from these negative comments or these critical comments. And one idea is that you look at the criticisms as assumptions. And so some of those comments, some of the assumptions that people had about the journalist, about their reporting and about their work were that journalists have a bias against midwives. That bias then led them to look at some data and purposefully avoid other data. Another assumption was that the newspaper is one-sided because it didn't look at specific data. Another assumption they got in criticism is that the newspaper is making money by making hospitals appear safer. Because the hospital is one of their advertisers, they did this story to help them. Another assumption was that the newspaper did this story to push anti-midwife legislation. So from all of these comments, if you take a second to kind of take a deep breath, step away, you can turn the criticisms, the negative comments, into statements, into assumptions. And then how you can build trust is to turn those assumptions into questions that address information gaps. So a lot of those comments were basically kind of wondering or focused on, why do this story? So you could, as a journalist, explain, why did you do this story? What questions did you set out to answer? Who did you talk to? There were questions about data, and actually there weren't questions, there were accusations, right, about the data they used. Well, you could explain what data you used. Why was that the right data? There also were questions about how the journalist was the journalist fair? And so you could explain, how did you work to be fair? And then there were lots of accusations about how ownership influenced this news coverage. And so how you turn that assumption that the newspaper is making money from this, it's connected to an advertiser, it is connected to wanting to push legislation, right? Is you can talk about how your journalism is funded and who owns the newspaper, who owns your news organization. And then more importantly, does that ownership influence, does that money influence your decision making? And if it doesn't, be crystal clear about that. And so that example, that case study, is a really good way that you can use that data set of comments that you are getting as an opportunity to answer questions and build trust with your audience and engage, even though the comments are critical. Because at the end of the day, if we don't address these gaps, no one else is going to. No one else is going to come to your news organization's defense, is going to come to your defense as a journalist and say, oh yes, I know Lynn did a great job on that reporting. People are not going to do that. We need to do that. And yes, it takes time, but it is worth it, because if we're willing to address that with our audiences, if we're willing to answer questions and address criticism, we are building that relationship. Even if it starts out as something that is critical, we are responding to them. By responding, we're building that relationship. By answering their question or providing more information, we are seen as a resource to them. And all of those things, building a relationship, being a resource, answering their questions, can help build trust. And so I have a couple tips on things you can do, and then I want to save time for some questions here. So if you have questions, feel free to start putting them in the chat if you would like. The question is here, okay, so what should we do? What are things journalists can do? Well, related to engagement, it really is pretty simple, but it takes time. You want to engage with your community. News flows differently because of technology than it used to. Before, you might put a newspaper out and you didn't really hear from anyone, or it took them a while to get a hold of you because it meant a phone call, actually writing and mailing something to you. Well, now they can instantly get in touch with you if they want. And that means they do expect a response. Or, and maybe not all the time, but some of the time, they want to hear from you. They want you to engage with them and to answer their questions. And so that is why we have to engage with our communities. We should be answering their questions, and we should be responding to comments. What's important here is to respond to the comments even when they are critical. And so that whole example I just gave you, those were critical comments. So it's good to respond even when they are critical, and using that tool of turning the critical comment into maybe a statement, and then thinking, is there a question I could answer? Is there something I could explain that would help them better understand our reporting? that is something that can be very, very helpful. When you respond, it's really, really important to use humility and diplomacy. Remember when I talked about something that we know is that being a news consumer is confusing, it's frustrating. We have to know that sometimes when people are reaching out to us, they may not be mad at our reporting necessarily. They might just be frustrated by all the information that's coming at them and they can't tell the difference between it. Or they just seem to not be able to get a good answer because there's bad information out there, right? There's misinformation, there's disinformation out there. And so if we have to know that when we're responding, let's try to use humility and an understanding about that. But we also need to know that that doesn't mean that we can't defend our work. And we shouldn't be afraid to explain how we do our work. And know that sometimes that may not be enough. People still might be upset or be critical of your reporting. But we should at least attempt to do that explanation at least once to people when they comment, if possible. And when we do that, tone is really important. Thanking them for commenting, even if they are being critical of your stories. And now, when I say all of this, if someone is attacking you, saying things that are racist, that are sexist, that are harmful, like threatening you in any way, that does not mean you have to put up with that or respond to that. You can report that content, block that person. You absolutely should document it and report it, because you should not, as a person, have to go through that. But when someone is just being critical of your reporting or has questions about it, that is when we should respond. And it's important to do that with humility and a tone that is appropriate, that is thanking them and not, I guess, attacking them back. One way that newsrooms have also gotten this feedback is through doing AMAs, or Ask Me Anythings. They're popular on Reddit, but we also have had newsrooms do it on Facebook and on Twitter. And this is an example of a screenshot of a newsroom that did the Ask Me Anything on Facebook. And they actually did it, and how they set it up was, I will be here for 3 hours to answer your questions. And basically he had them add the questions in the comments, and then he went through for 3 hours and answered the questions via text. We've also had newsrooms do it through a Facebook Live or on Instagram Live. But as you can see, it reached a lot of people, got a lot of engagement, and he got 390 comments overall. An example of how to respond with the correct tone is, again, someone just asked, why do you choose not to cover Bernie Sanders rallies? And the person was like, hi, we will cover Sanders if he comes to our area. Here's how we cover candidates. Simple question, you know. Obviously, that person may have an assumption that they don't cover Bernie Sanders, but instead you just answer the question, provide them with information. Here's someone else who says they want to see more coverage about people that are changing lives rather than negative news or that bad news, right? That's a common complaint we get. And so the journalist responds and says, thank you. Like, I agree. We want to see more positive too. And then he says, that's why we have a series called Positively Cincinnati, and then gives a link. And the person responds and says, thank you. Awesome link. And tells them, and then he responds and tells her when it airs. But this is a person who may not have known about that, right? Shelby may not have known about that coverage and that existed. So that's a complaint, right? Like a comment that's negative, but you use it as an opportunity, using the right tone to provide information and share a little bit about what you are doing. When engaging with people online specifically, it's really important to have a comment policy. That comment policy should be something that is attached to every one of your social networks. And then if you have a comment policy, it makes it easier to do this type of interaction and to engage with your community. Things you can do is you can, in your comment policy, say that you will reward productive conversations by liking it, sharing it, or responding to it. You can say that you will delete or block a user if necessary because they posted something that's offensive. Here's an example from my colleague Joy, who says, this is an example of how you could respond if you have a comment policy. She says, "Hi folks, thanks for the conversation. As a reminder, our policy," you include the link, "prohibits personal attacks. We do that because we know you value civil, respectful discussions. We'll delete comments that violate the policy." And so if you do delete things, or if you see someone doing something that's against your policy, follow up on it, delete it, block it, but then post something like Joy is suggesting, where you talk about why that happened and then reshare the link. So those are kind of tips on, as a newsroom, how you can respond. Then there are questions of, as an individual journalist, when should you respond? When should you jump into conversations, especially if the comments are critical? Some questions to ask yourself before you do jump in is your presence as a journalist welcome? So what that means is, if you're looking at comments and it just seems to be two people going back and forth, maybe that's not a time where it makes sense for you to jump in. If there are multiple different people asking similar questions, or talking about journalism, or talking about your process in a way that is not true, that would be a good opportunity that you could explain your work, explain your process. If you do that, you want to make sure that it's clear who you are, or that it is an account that you use sort of more publicly and not personally. You also want to see if there's a link or something that you might be able to share that could help move the conversation forward, similar to that example from WCPO. If there's something that you could add, again, about your newsroom process, that could be helpful. The other thing is that sometimes people are critical of something, or just make a very broad assumption, and they say, "Oh, you're fake news. Oh, you're part of the liberal media," or, "Oh, I don't trust any journalist." It's okay to ask a question and follow up to get more specific. That actually is something I would recommend doing more often than not. So you have a better way of asking, of helping address their comment or their criticism. Ask them, well, what makes you think that this is fake news? Why do you think that we are not accurate? And see what they say, so you can better answer and address that comment and that criticism. So as Gülsin actually mentioned in the beginning, if you want more help on this, we have a newsletter that comes out every Tuesday that has actionable tips on how to build trust. We also have lots of handouts, and I'll put these links in the chat here when I'm done sharing my screen, but we have handouts that walk you through how to create a comment policy, how to be transparent about different things, what to include in staff bios. And then also of examples of newsrooms doing this work that you can search to see on engagement. We actually have so many examples of engagement to see, okay, how do people do this on Facebook? How are people using WhatsApp? How are people using Instagram? So that is another resource as well. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And if there are questions, I'm here to answer those. And I'm also, as I'm waiting for questions, going to put some of those links there in the chat.
Thank you so much, Lynn. If you don't mind, I will kick the questions with a very personal question. Personal meaning that I was obsessing with this notion, and we have some media entrepreneurs on the call in the audience too. So I'm sure that it's a subject that they are also highly engaged with in Turkey.
Yes.
So when you know that as Trusting News, based on your experience, you preach and you really highly encourage transparency. In Turkey, the issue is that the most of the funding for the independent news outlets are coming from either foreign aid agency, either foundations, foreign foundations which were set up to promote independent journalism. And in Turkey, we have, I'm sure that everywhere in most of the places in the world also, they have this similar problem. The transparency is how to say, a double-edged sword, in a sense that the funding, especially like foreign funding, whenever you are transparent about it, some part of the readership is getting even much more possessed about the idea of like being your editorial team being under the influence of a certain state powers. So how to approach this foreign grants, foreign funding situation, especially in countries like Turkey, which are going through democratic challenges. And also it happens not only for foreign funding, sometimes when a new investment is received with highly big excitement around the newsroom, it can come back to hurt the newsroom with some negative comments. So how to be transparent about it and how to overcome?
Yes, so that is a great question. And it's something that we have worked with Radio Free Europe on, actually, because they run across that at their different services as well. This kind of, in their case, being funded by the United States, and that is seen as a negative. That because you are funded by the United States, you are pushing a certain agenda, right? That's sort of the accusation that people think. And so what we say is that, one, you should get on the record about how you are funded. But to build that trust, you want to make that connection that does that funding influence your news decisions? Hopefully it does not, right? Hopefully you can say, yes, we are funded. We receive funding from a group in the United States, but they don't have any control over our content. And you want to say that very specifically, get on the record about that. And if someone still doesn't believe that or trust that, because they may not, point to stories where maybe you have been critical of, in this case, maybe it's the United States, maybe it is a company, right? Maybe receive some funding from a company, that you can say, we're able to report on. I know this happens with NPR here in the US. They're able to report on Amazon or Microsoft, even though they receive funding from them, but they are critical sometimes. The stories are sometimes critical, and they can point to those as examples. The other thing you can do is you can talk about within that, like, what are the goals of your reporting? Maybe some of them do align with what might be considered, I don't know, like democratic or liberal or something that is part of the West, right? Explain that so that it doesn't seem as if you're just doing it because of where the funding comes from. You're doing that actually because these are your values as a news organization that you have independently of where the funding is coming from.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And also, like, anytime, please, from the audience, also feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat box. And another thing that's on top of your answer, that before, like when I started journalism like 15 years ago, our duty was limited to report well, write well, and be a good journalist. And now we have all these additional duties to explain our values and mission. And so in your experience in the trusting news, so the communication flows both ways. And how does it change the view of journalism that we have? I mean, that you explained so well in your presentation, but for journalists like us, what are the skills that we should be looking to develop?
Yeah, so that is a great point. And when I first started working with trusting news, and probably one of a pushback that we get is that, journalists are so busy already. We have so many things to do. This is one more thing. So how do you work this in? And so what we have realized is really, one, building trust is so important, because if you don't have it, then you work so hard. You do all that reporting, you do all of that work for people to not read it because they don't trust you and they're not going to click on it, right? They're not going to listen to it. So we feel that trust should be part of the reporting process. And really what we are thinking about and talking about here is doing journalism a little bit differently. Engagement should be baked into all of your reporting. And so what that means is, let's say you're getting ready to tackle a big topic. Maybe it's the war going on with Ukraine and Russia, and you are the reporter that's supposed to lead that reporting. Well, there are so many different things you can cover related to that, right? I mean, so many different things. One thing you could do before you start, or as you continue to cover, ask your audience, what do you want to know about this? What are things that would be helpful for you, right? And then based on that feedback, that might influence your reporting and where it heads and what you cover next. Maybe you check in with your community as you cover, maybe you cover health, or with COVID, that's another one. There's so many things you can focus on. So you can use engagement to help inform your reporting. And that can be an easy way that then you're not really the one that's making the decisions. You're asking for feedback, and then you're using that feedback to help inform. So the idea is, how can you build the engagement into what you do as a reporter? So, the first thing you're doing is you're finding stories. Well, use engagement to help you find those stories. You're finding sources, right? Or verifying information. Use engagement to find sources. Maybe you go to the same person all the time, or you use someone often in your stories. Well, maybe there's others that you could use that live in different areas or have a different perspective. You can use engagement strategies to find that person. Then when you publish the story, publish it, share it, ask them what they think about it. What do they want to know more about? What questions do they have? Is there anything that's missing? And then if you are able to do that at the end, that feedback might lead to a great follow-up story. We've seen that happen so often that, oh, now we have a little more information and we have a better story to follow up on. If you are a news manager or someone who can kind of set up expectations for a journalist or for a reporter, if you can try to allow time for engagement during their week, maybe it's a couple hours on a Wednesday, I don't know, that it's built into the process, that can be extremely helpful for the journalist and to make sure that this engagement is happening.
Definitely. Again, like, we have still time for questions from the audience. So, but since we don't have currently, so I will go on. And actually, one thing that it really resonated with me in your presentation, Lynn, when you said that there are two aspects of it, like cognitive trust and affective trust. And in the last 5, let's say 6 years, that especially in the US and later on with the Western democracies also, there's this whole debate about the post-truth. And to me, it was always a bit, I always took the debate with a bit of salt, with a grain of salt, since the news business also was never purely rational. So people approach the news gathering, and the way they interact with the news, for example, buying a certain newspaper was a part of the identity for so long. And so where does it fit in your work to ensure them trust through engagement and knowledge? That whether, yes, we are journalists, we are reporting facts, but there's a very undeniable emotional aspect in the journalism business too. Did you encounter any criticism about including emotions in the news, or what does the future look like?
Yeah, so that is something that is, I think, continues to be highly debated, especially here in the US. We saw it highly debated during COVID. And during COVID, we were having, different protests and around Black Lives Matters and minorities. And so you saw this come up a lot with that, because as a journalist, you sort of are told not to share who you are, not to talk about your beliefs, not to share your opinions, especially if you're reporting news. But it becomes very difficult to tell someone to not say that their life matters, or that they can't support something that pushes toward human rights or rights for people based on race or sex or ethnicity, right? And so to say you have to hide that can be very problematic. And so there is kind of a line between like what you as an individual are willing to share and maybe what another journalist is willing to share. And so with that, kind of the cognitive comes easy to journalists, the reporting the facts, right? We know how to do that. Sometimes that relational, that the effective trust is a little bit harder. And so what we encourage journalists to do is think about, what are things you are willing to share? I know when I've done this, I literally have taken a pad of paper and wrote things about myself that I'm okay with people knowing, that I'm okay sharing and talking about publicly. And then thinking about, how does that impact your reporting? Maybe that means you might not cover something or a topic because you feel that strongly about it. Maybe it means you actually do cover it, but you're going to make sure you add a line or two that talks about your views and how you're keeping them out of the story despite having them, right? So you're being transparent about it. You're talking about that conflict of interest. But what we do find is that people do want to know about who you are. They want to know, even if it's just little tidbits, they want to know, and that is a way that they will relate to you and build trust. We see this happening with TikTok all the time now, right? People feel more connected to people because they're sharing. And so we as journalists just need to think about, what are we comfortable sharing? How is that going to impact our work? And are there things that we're just not going to cover, and or that we're going to disclose every time we do cover, to make sure we're being transparent with our communities about it?
Exactly. Thank you so much, Lynn. And transparency about, like, I know that in the American tradition, that objectivity is highly demanded, but also now introducing a healthy dose of, since objectivity, it's a very hard goal to achieve, introducing a certain subjectivity and being open about it would make huge differences in the approach to the audiences. So before we call it off, is there any question from the audience? Would be nice to have your contributions also. Sure. Ozan Bey, okay, would you like to read your question, or should I?
Okay. Yeah, I can read it. Yeah.
Thank you.
So Ozan says, hi, everyone. I would like to ask a similar question like Gülsin's, but in the field. When we work for a foreign newspaper, people who we interview in Turkey say, quote, of course you will show us negative to the world. They, foreigners, always would like to show us weak or are interested in our weakness. Sometimes it is really difficult to convince people and tell our, quote, good intentions. What do you think of this prejudice or doubt that people feel, and how will we overcome it? So this is a great example of, right, that the criticism or the comment is critical. It's critical of your reporting. It's critical of how they think you are doing your job. The other thing that's interesting is they have made an assumption about that, and that's a negative assumption. And so how you could combat this or explain is to talk about, well, why do you cover the stories that you cover, right? Why do you cover the stories you cover? Why do you cover the topics that you cover? If you look at your stories and they are maybe negative or might be perceived as negative about Turkey, is there a reason you are doing that? And so I recently was talking to a journalist in Uzbekistan, and he was explaining the reason that they are critical about their hospitals or critical about things in their country is because they want it to improve. It's their way of holding the government accountable. It's their way of trying to push for change, to push to make things better for people in the country. And I was like, that's a great explanation. I think with our journalism, we do try to do that, right? We try to hold people accountable to create change. So explain that. Get on the record about that. You could get on the record about that maybe in a couple paragraphs on your website. You could also just respond to that in a comment and then share that more widely. And so that is, I hope that helps. That's an example of someone being critical of your coverage, but they're critical because they are making an assumption about why you're doing something. So now it's your job to say, is that why we're doing this reporting? Do we want to make people in our coverage of Turkey look weak? I'm assuming the answer is no. There's another answer there, right? So explain that answer and share that answer widely.
Ahmed, you have a question. Would you like to write or say it out loud?
Okay, I can speak to make things easier and faster. So thanks for the great conversation and panel. It was really helpful. My question is actually about some of the earlier talks, especially about like journalists being open about their work themselves or how their organizations are running. Like, we know that like being open, being transparent is always great, and it always brings some additional trust both to organization and the news that are published. But the problem we also face in the current situation is that journalists are always under attack in many different ways. For example, we know that there can be like just one news story and all of the Twitter and all of the Facebook will come after a journalist. And usually, which we have so many different examples, that news outlets or the management just left them alone to deal with most of the stuff and doesn't really provide the necessary tools or mechanisms to defend themselves in those cases. And also there are times when journalists try to improve their organizations to become better places, which we have quite a new and major example with New Yorker and Erin Overbay. And they can just simply targeted by the organization and even let go of their jobs. So we are talking about making journalists more trustworthy by being open, being transparent about how they are working, how they are doing. But there are also a lot of things that comes with, a lot of negative things that comes with being open, and the current organizations or the system we have for the journalism is not on the journalist side. So do you think like there should be things that needs to be changed, or what's your general observation about the situation of journalists being left alone in in situations like this?
Yeah, so I think kind of the gist of your question is based on, one, journalist safety, and that they are attacked. So that's one thing. And I'm going to share an example that I have here where we worked with Radio Free Europe we were working with their Russian newsroom and their newsroom in Hungary. And in Russia, there is the issue of safety and not being able to disclose who people are, but they still wanted who their reporters are, but they still wanted to share what their values are. And so how they did it was through a series of Facebook videos. And they basically created animation talking about who they are. And they also created one that had just B-roll and images with someone adding text to screen, and then also a voiceover where they were able to talk about what their goals are as a news organization. And they asked their reporters, like, why do you do this work? It can be very dangerous. So why do you do this? And they were able to share some of that without identifying who the journalist is. So that's one tactic that you can use. The other thing I would say is it's absolutely important to make sure that you are keeping your journalists safe and as safe as they can be. And if people are not comfortable speaking out and sharing more about who they are, then that is okay. You can find other ways to do it by maybe speaking as an organization about those goals. And again, remember, you're not going to make everyone happy. You're not going to convince everyone to trust you, but we find there are a lot more people in the middle that you can help understand those values and help trust you. And it looks like, is there one more question?
Yes, Gökhan Bey, please. Thank you.
Thanks for the, what do you call, speech. The problems are universal, like the journalism itself, but still this trust matters. I mean, still I mean, I find it still too fine for a country like Turkey. Yeah, we are talking about trust for the press, but are we? I mean, our institutions, our outlets, are they really after it? I mean, there's a matter of transparency in Turkish press. I mean, we can hardly know. Actually, we have no idea what are they funding, and we still don't know if they are doing something to recognize their own reader or viewers. So I'm not sure if I mean if you want to produce something trustable, you need to evaluate it. You need to measure it. But I'm not sure if this matters for Turkish press too.
So are you saying you don't think the Turkish press is willing to share where funding comes from?
Well, it's not only the funding stuff. We usually ask the question: are they doing this job for reporting, or are they doing this some other aims?
So like this question of hidden agenda, or that there's the thought that there is an agenda.
Right. I mean, it's not a surprise that everyone has an agenda, like human beings, even the what you call, the objective one. But we can still learn how do they fund it, or what do they expect from the readers, or if and we are not sure about if they want to hear from the readers too.
Yeah, I think so. All of what you just said is a lot why people have trust in news, right? I mean, that is what leads to the distrust, them not knowing answers to that question, them not knowing how someone is funded, them not knowing, and I'm so glad you said this, we as journalists have an agenda. I wish we would use that word more and say, we have an agenda toward the facts. A lot of us would probably say we have an agenda towards seeing our community thrive. We want to see our community be successful. We want to see people live better lives. We don't want to see people living in poverty and suffering, right? And I wish we would say that, because does that make our reporting biased or bad? At least have a starting point of that conversation. And so I wish journalists would do more of that and use more of that language. And to your point, because that sounds like it's not happening, that will lead to distrust. It will lead to people making misassumptions. And so we do know that by being transparent about those very things, you can build trust with your community.
Gülsin Bey, thank you so much for your question. It's really contributed to the conversation. And Lynn, thank you so much for making time for us on a Monday morning. And so the recording will be available on YouTube, and we will share the link with all the participants. And Lynn shared many links to Trusting News work. We will be including them in the email. So thank you so much, Lynn, in case that you would like to add up something.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Please use those links. If there's something that you cannot find, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'll put my email in here again. And then Gülsin, also please feel free to, in the follow-up email, share my email as well. Sure. I'm glad to help people find anything. We are here as a resource. This is so important. I think it's so important, not just here in the US, but all over the world. Because if people don't trust us, they're not going to get more information. And without information, it's hard for them to make a decision. So thank you all so much.